They said she couldn't live without him, that her beauty was her only currency, her husband her only fortune. But when he tried to cage her, she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply walked away. What began as a wealthy man's cruel challenge, "You wouldn't last a week without me, Mila," turned into the rise of a woman who built her own empire from the ashes of betrayal. In a world of power, secrets, and deception, she discovered something far more valuable than money: freedom. This is not just a story about revenge, it's about rebirth, about how one woman outsmarted the men who underestimated her, exposed a billion-dollar empire of corruption, and turned pain into power. Welcome to My Wealthy Husband Said I Couldn't Live Without Him. Watch me build my own empire. A story of love, loss, and the quiet strength that changes everything. If you believe in life-changing stories, undercover power, and the kind of justice that makes your heart race, you're in the right place. Stay till the end, because the sweetest sound in this story isn't victory, it's silence. The kind that only comes when a woman finally owns her freedom. Go ahead, walk away. He said it with a smirk that had once made me feel safe, before I learned that confidence could also be cruelty wearing a tailored suit. My husband leaned back in his leather chair, the crystal tumbler in his hand catching the light like a trophy. "You wouldn't last a week without me, Mila," he said, swirling his Macallan as if he were stirring my entire life. The chandelier above us scattered reflections across the marble counter. The counter he'd chosen in the house he'd bought, for the wife he thought he owned. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply reached into my Chanel bag and placed my keys on the counter, one by one. House, car, safe. Each one made a sharp, deliberate sound as it hit the stone, the kind of sound that echoes in the memory of a man who suddenly realizes he's lost control. "You're right," I said softly. "Let's find out." He laughed then, a brittle, disbelieving sound, but it faltered when I turned toward the door. My heels clicked against the marble floor, steady, unhurried. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. Some exits speak louder in silence. That was 3 hours ago. Now I was sitting in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, the same hotel where we used to host charity galas. Only this time, I wasn't the decoration at his side. I was the woman he underestimated, the one watching our penthouse through a live security feed on my phone, a feed he didn't even know I had access to. On the tiny screen, he paced our kitchen like a caged animal, phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his partner Nathan, maybe his father. Definitely not the police. What could he even report? My wife left me and took nothing. The concierge approached with a kind smile. "Miss Hawthorne, your suite is ready." Miss Hawthorne, my maiden name. It had felt foreign when I spoke it aloud that morning while booking the room, but hearing it again felt like oxygen. It was the only thing he'd never been able to buy, trade, or trademark. I paid in full. My card, my account, my money. 6 figures that had quietly accumulated from what Ashton once mocked as my cute little hobby. He used to tell people at parties, "Mila plays with stocks like other wives play tennis." The guests would laugh, and I'd smile, the good wife, the good joke. What none of them knew was that I'd turned his starter allowance of $10,000 into something far more dangerous: independence. The suite wasn't as big as our penthouse, but it was mine. Every inch of it hummed with the kind of freedom money can't buy, only earn. I set my single suitcase on the bed, the one I'd been filling slowly over the last 3 months, hidden at my gym under the label donations. Ashton tracked every card, every transaction, but he never questioned gym visits. Trophy wives, after all, had to maintain their value. My phone buzzed. 17 missed calls. The first voicemail played accidentally when I tried to silence it. "Mila, this is ridiculous. Come home. We'll talk about whatever upset you." His voice carried that same careful control he used during business meetings, as if handling a volatile stock instead of a woman, By the fifth message, the control was cracking. You can't just leave. Half of everything is in both our names. You need my signature too. I deleted every message. Each one felt lighter than the last. Just that morning, I had stood at our floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city wake beneath me. The coffee maker had already brewed itself. Ashton had programmed it months ago. Another system he controlled. The silk robe he'd gifted me for Christmas had been the wrong size, chosen by his assistant, not him. It itched against my skin. Today was our anniversary. He hadn't mentioned it once. Somewhere between the ignored milestones and the condescending laughter, I had stopped expecting anything from him except ownership. At the Ritz, I took a long breath. The air smelled different, not of imported cologne or polished marble, but of possibility. I opened my suitcase and took out a small silver flash drive, one of several I'd hidden across the city. Each one held copies of documents, passwords, and records, the blueprints of his empire. He'd once told me, "Without my connections, you're nobody." He was wrong. Without me, his empire was missing its quiet architect, the one who knew where every brick had been laid and where the cracks were beginning to show. My reflection in the mirror didn't look like a runaway wife. It looked like strategy. I picked up my phone and opened the last photo I'd taken before walking out. A line of keys gleaming on a marble counter. Symbols of control turned into a declaration of war. He'd said I couldn't live without him. Now he was the one calling 17 times, terrified of what I'd do next. He thought I'd walk away broken, but I wasn't leaving to escape him. I was leaving to build something bigger, something that couldn't be bought, sold, or signed away. He wanted to know who I was without him. He was about to find out. The morning light slid through the penthouse windows like a lie, bright, polished, and pretending to be something pure. I used to love that view. It made me feel lucky. But that morning, luck felt like another illusion Ashton had sold me. The last time I'd stood in his study, the air had smelled of money and power. The faint leather of his chair, the sharp citrus of his cologne, and the quiet hum of control. I'd gone in to find our insurance papers, something practical, something harmless. What I found instead was proof that my marriage was an investment portfolio, and I was the asset he was preparing to liquidate. It started with a sound, a small metallic clatter. His voice recorder, the one he used for big ideas, had fallen to the floor when I reached for a file. The device began to play automatically. I almost turned it off, but then I heard my name. "She asked to see our investment statements yesterday," Ashton's voice said, casual, amused. Laughter followed, not mine, but Nathan's, his partner. I told her they were too complicated, too many numbers. She actually believed me. Nathan, I could get her to sign over her kidneys and she'd just ask what pen to use. The room seemed to shrink. My pulse roared in my ears. I pressed pause, staring at the timestamp. Last Tuesday, the day I'd brought him sushi at his office, smiling like a fool while his new analyst smirked in the corner. My fingers trembled as I hit play again. "That's why this type is perfect," Ashton continued. "Pretty enough for photos, dumb enough to control, grateful enough to stay quiet. My father taught me well. Marry beauty, rent intelligence." There it was. The truth, spoken in the voice I used to love. Smooth, confident, deadly. I placed the recorder back exactly where it had fallen, angled just as he'd left it, because some evidence is too powerful to destroy. Then I saw something else on the desk, a folder marked prenuptial amendments. My heart told me not to open it. Curiosity said otherwise. Inside were new documents, notarized, signed, except the signature wasn't mine. It was forged. The amendments added fresh clauses about abandonment and forfeiture of assets, all conveniently filed last month. According to this, if I left without just cause, everything would revert to him. Every account, every property, every piece of my life, gone. I stared at the papers, realizing this wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was premeditation. He hadn't, just wanted control. He wanted insurance. He was planning my financial death the way he planned his mergers, strategically, quietly, profitably. Standing in that cold, immaculate study, surrounded by trophies of his success, awards, framed contracts, the family portrait I once thought was love, something inside me hardened. It didn't break, it crystallized. He wasn't cruel because he didn't love me. He was cruel because he didn't see me. To him, I was a line item, a tax benefit, a decorative return on investment. When I left that night, I didn't just take my suitcase. I took clarity. Now, sitting at the Ritz-Carlton suite, I opened my laptop and pulled up my private files, encrypted under names he'd never think to check. Years of his transactions copied from joint accounts, transfers between shell companies, hidden portfolios. Ashton believed I only cared about dresses and dinner parties. He had no idea I'd been watching, learning. I'd studied his habits the way he studied markets. And if there was one thing I knew about markets, it was this: what goes up always comes down, especially when it's built on deceit. The phone buzzed again. Not his number this time, but his father's. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch, the man who'd once raised a toast to me at a family gala and called me a good acquisition. I let the call go to voicemail. I already knew what he'd say. Come back, be reasonable. Think of the business. To them, marriage was never about love. It was a contract, and I had just defaulted. A new text appeared a few minutes later, this time from Margaret, Richard's secretary, the woman who'd poured tea at every family gathering, quiet and invisible, the kind of person powerful men forget exists. Heard you left. Room 1247. When you're ready to talk, I have 40 years of information you need. 40 years. The words hit harder than any threat Ashton could make. I stared at the screen, feeling something dangerous curl inside me, curiosity laced with vengeance. For the first time, I smiled, a small, quiet, deliberate smile. He thought I'd crumble, that I'd beg, that I'd come crawling back because the penthouse, the car, the status, all of it defined me. But he forgot who he married. He forgot that before I was his wife, I was myself. Before he dressed me up in gold, I'd already built something more valuable: resilience. I closed the laptop, stood by the window, and looked toward our building in the distance. The lights were still on in his office. He was probably tearing through every drawer, searching for what I'd taken. He wouldn't find anything. I hadn't stolen a thing. I'd only made copies. The real theft would come later, legally, publicly, beautifully. The city below buzzed with life. Somewhere out there, Margaret was waiting. Somewhere, the empire of lies was starting to wobble. Ashton always said business was about leverage. He was right. He just never realized that I was the one holding it. That night, as I turned off the lights and slipped into bed alone for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. I felt awake. He said I wouldn't survive a week without him. I gave myself 7 days, not to survive, but to destroy his illusion. After that, I'd take the rest of my life proving him wrong. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for him to call again. By then, I had built a rhythm at the Ritz. Morning trades, afternoon walks through Central Park, evening scanning files Margaret had slipped me in careful doses. Each folder revealed another crack in the Whitmore empire. But beneath the calm, I knew something was coming. When Ashton's number finally lit up my screen, I didn't answer at first. Let him wait, I thought. Let him taste the silence he used to feed me. On the 5th ring, I picked up. "Mila," he said, voice low, careful, as if I were a wild animal he needed to coax. "We should have dinner, just to talk, to be civilized." Civilized. The word felt like poison wrapped in politeness. I agreed anyway, not because I wanted to see him, but because I needed to know how far he'd go. The salon on 5th Avenue was the same one I'd used throughout our marriage. Celeste, my hairdresser, worked with the same quiet confidence she always had, fingers weaving through my hair as if nothing had changed. "Special occasion?" she asked, and I caught the irony in her reflection. "Anniversary dinner," I said. She smiled, not knowing the weight of those 2 words. "How wonderful. Where's he taking you?" "La Bernardine, his favorite." Of course. A place where the waiters already knew his wine preferences, where the staff called him Mr. Whitmore in hushed, reverent tones. A stage, not a restaurant. The confirmation email sat neatly in my inbox, right beside the 17 legal documents my lawyer had prepared for the real purpose of tonight: leverage. The dress I chose was midnight blue, his favorite color on me. It cost more than most people's monthly salary, charged to the credit card he hadn't frozen yet. As I slipped it on, I studied myself in the mirror. Sleek, composed, controlled. The perfect wife he'd curated. Except for the flash drive hidden in my clutch, holding 40 gigabytes of evidence. When I left the boutique, my phone buzzed with a message. "Small change," Ashton texted. "Nathan and Diana joining us. Need to discuss Singapore deal. Same time." My fingers hovered over the screen. So this wasn't dinner. It was business. And I was the entertainment. "Perfect," I replied, adding nothing else. He wouldn't notice that I'd left out the heart emoji, the cheerful punctuation he'd come to expect. He never noticed the small things. And that would be his undoing. Half an hour later, another message came. "Actually, Father insists we come to the estate. He's having something catered. 8 p.m. Of course he was. When the king summons, the pawns gather. I changed the cab's direction and gave Richard's address. 12 acres of manicured perfection, every hedge trimmed to military precision, every light designed to flatter wealth. When the gates opened, it wasn't a home I entered. It was a fortress. One built to keep people like me in and secrets like theirs out." Patricia, Richard's 3rd wife, answered the door. She was younger than me, maybe 28, beautiful in the way exhaustion can be. Her smile was polite, but her eyes whispered, "Why did you come?" Inside, the air smelled of cigars, whiskey, and money too old to breathe freely. Ashton stood near the fireplace, his tumbler already half empty, his laughter loud and hollow. He didn't even pause when he saw me. Didn't say, "You look beautiful," or even, "Hello." Just a flick of his eyes, a glance that assessed, measured, dismissed. Nathan waved from across the room. His wife Diana sat apart, stirring her drink with the kind of focus reserved for people who'd rather disappear. Then came Richard, booming voice, false warmth. "The lovely Mila, though I hear you've been not so lovely lately. This separation nonsense. Bad for business, my dear." The laughter that followed was practiced, polite, suffocating. I felt a presence at my side. Margaret, the secretary who'd served this family longer than any of their wives had lasted. She held a tray of champagne flutes. As she passed me one, her fingers brushed mine. "Some anniversaries," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "are about endings, not beginnings." Her eyes flicked toward the dining room, and I understood. This wasn't just dinner. This was theater. The table had been set for 12. I recognized most of the faces. Hedge fund partners, their wives, a few lawyers. They'd orchestrated this gathering to watch me fall back in line. I sat between Nathan and Graham's wife, directly across from Ashton. Behind him hung a massive portrait of Richard's father, the original Whitmore, founder of their empire. His painted eyes seemed to watch me, smug and unblinking. Dinner began in silence. Silverware clinked, wine poured, smiles flashed. Somewhere between the soup and the halibut, Ashton decided to perform. "Funny story," he began, raising his glass, "about how Mila and I met." He waited until all eyes turned to him. I knew that tone, the same one he used on investors before closing a deal. She was at a finance conference, completely lost. Wandered into a derivatives panel thinking it was about art. Laughter erupted. Too loud, too fake. She asked if hedge funds were about landscaping. Thought we were discussing actual hedges. The story was fiction, a polished lie designed to entertain his peers. I had been at that conference presenting my graduate thesis on market manipulation, but that truth didn't fit his narrative. The damsel he saved from ignorance. I glanced around the table. Nathan smirked. Diana looked away. Richard raised his glass and said, "Well, thank God for lost puppies. They make the best pets." The room laughed again. I didn't. Under the table, Diana's hand found mine, a silent act of mercy, but pity burns just as much as mockery. I excused myself. "Powder room," I said, the polite excuse of women escaping humiliation. The hallway was quiet, lined with portraits of men whose smiles hid generations of corruption. Richard's study door stood ajar, his computer screen glowing faintly. I slipped inside. On his monitor, spreadsheets flickered. Offshore accounts, coded transfers, numbered trusts. I memorized everything. A name, a date, a password scribbled on a post-it. Each detail another thread in the web I was untangling. Through the window, I could see the table. Ashton standing now, glass in hand, playing the role of devoted husband for an audience that applauded his every word. He thought I was broken. He thought I was gone. He didn't realize that while he was toasting his empire, I was learning how to burn it down. When I returned, dessert was being served, creme brulee, perfectly torched. He looked at me then, finally, and smiled, that confident, dangerous smile. I smiled back. Sweet, soft, deliberate, the kind of smile that hides a storm. He raised his glass to me. I raised mine too. Only one of us knew it was a goodbye. The next morning, the city felt different, sharper, more alive, like the world had been tilted slightly in my favor. The humiliation from last night hadn't faded, but it had transformed. It wasn't pain anymore, it was fuel. I replayed Margaret's whisper in my head. Some anniversaries are about endings, not beginnings. She had known exactly what that dinner was, a stage, a trap, a warning. And she had also known that I was ready to stop being their entertainment. At 9 a.m., I called the Ritz concierge and requested a black car. "Destination?" he asked. "Chinatown," I said. "Jade Garden Restaurant." The name had been in Margaret's text. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. The Jade Garden was the kind of place no one from the Whitmore world would ever visit. The windows fogged from decades of steam, the scent of sesame oil clinging to the air, the perfect hiding place for truth. Margaret sat in the back corner, wearing a pale cardigan despite the heat. She looked like someone's grandmother who'd lost her way, harmless, invisible. But her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "Mrs. Whitmore," she greeted softly. "Hawthorne," I corrected. "I'm using my own name now." Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Good, you'll need it." She pushed a small tin toward me, the kind that usually held butter cookies. "Open it," she said. Inside, wrapped in tissue, paper, was a lipstick tube. I looked up at her, confused. "Twist the bottom 3 times, she instructed. I did. The tube separated, revealing a flash drive, matte silver, small enough to hide in the palm of my hand. 16 gigabytes, she said quietly. Started collecting in 1982. I stared at her, the words barely processing. "Collecting what?" "Insurance," she said, "for women like you." She told me everything. Richard's first wife, Elena, had been suspicious of the books. Minor inconsistencies, transactions that didn't match reports. She'd asked Margaret to keep an eye on things. 2 weeks later, Elena drove her Mercedes off a bridge. Perfect weather, no skid marks, no brake failure ever confirmed. Then came Caroline, the second wife, MBA from Wharton, brilliant, confident. She started asking the wrong questions in year 4. Richard had her committed for exhaustion. She signed her divorce papers from a psychiatric ward and vanished. By the time the third wife, Jennifer, arrived, Margaret had already begun saving everything. Memos, expense reports, bribes disguised as bonuses, SEC filings that didn't align with the internal ledgers. I couldn't stop them, Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly, but I could document them. She took a sip of tea, steadying herself. You're not the first, but if you're careful, you can be the last. The waiter arrived with dumplings. We didn't touch them. Why me? I asked finally. Why tell me all this? Because you're different, she said simply. They picked you because you were beautiful, polished, and just clever enough to impress their friends, but not clever enough, they thought, to threaten them. They underestimated you. She leaned closer. You've already started taking notes, haven't you? I smiled slightly. Old habits, she chuckled. Good, you'll need them. That flash drive holds 40 years of evidence. Richard's bribes, Ashton's trades, Nathan's shell companies. But it's not enough on its own. The regulators won't move without corroboration. You'll need internal records, emails, transfers, signatures. I can get them, I said without hesitation. Her eyes searched mine, testing for fear. You understand what that means? If you're caught, I won't be. Margaret nodded slowly, approvingly. You sound like Elena when she started. Just be smarter than she was. Don't confront them. Document. Wait, let them destroy themselves. She stood to leave, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her thin shoulders. There's something else, she said, lowering her voice. Your husband isn't just complicit. He's planning to replace you. I froze. Replace me? There's a paper trail, she said. Hotel bookings, flowers charged to corporate cards, gifts to Nathan's wife, Diana. He's been grooming her. And if he can't make her the new Mrs. Whitmore, he'll find a way to make you look unstable enough to institutionalize, just like Caroline. For a second, the room seemed to spin. The waiter's voice, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the city, all faded into a low roar. They're preparing a narrative, Margaret continued. That anniversary dinner, it wasn't reconciliation, it was documentation. You walking out, your emotional reaction, they'll use it to paint you as volatile. When they file for separation, they'll claim you're mentally unfit. It's all been done before. My hands tightened around the teacup until my knuckles whitened. Not this time. Her eyes softened. Good. Because the difference between a victim and a survivor is timing. That night, I sat in my suite with my laptop open and the flash drive plugged in. Folders appeared one by one, labeled by year, by crime, by victim. Each document was a ghost. Elena, Caroline, Jennifer. Each name a warning, each story ending the same way. Erased. Not mine. I called my lawyer, Patricia Kim, a quiet woman from Connecticut who specialized in asset protection and corporate law. I need to create a company, I told her. Something invisible, something that can't be traced back to me. She hesitated. What kind of company? One that sounds like nothing but could mean everything. When I hung up, I opened a new folder on my laptop. I named it Phantom Rose Holdings, LLC. Margaret was right. Evidence wasn't enough. I needed structure, leverage, a way to move money, documents, and power without a trace. By dawn, the company existed. Legal, invisible, and untouchable. I stared at the name on the screen. Phantom Rose. A flower that could bloom in darkness. He thought I was his weakness. He was about to learn that I was his exposure. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday. It was subtle, almost invisible. A whispered complaint from a client, a delayed call from a partner, a missing zero in a spreadsheet Ashton didn't double-check. Little things, fragile things. But that's how empires fall. Not with explosions, but with hairline fractures that spread until everything collapses. Ashton didn't see it coming. Men like him never do. He still woke up at 5:30 a.m., went running along the river, dressed in the same tailored suits, smiled the same weaponized smile. He still kissed the air beside my cheek when we passed in the lobby of our building, pretending civility for the doorman's benefit. To the world, he was the picture of control. But control, I'd learned, is the first illusion to crack. After my meeting with Margaret, I became a ghost in my own marriage. Quiet, watchful, omnipresent. I returned to the penthouse under the pretense of working things out, a move that delighted Richard and lulled Ashton into arrogant ease. He thought my return meant surrender. It was reconnaissance. While he worked, I studied. While he slept, I copied. The penthouse itself was a museum of his ego, mahogany, glass, and cold steel. But behind the gleam were secrets buried in plain sight. I found them in his office drawers, in the emails he thought he'd deleted, in the cloud backups he assumed I didn't know existed. He had an entire digital empire, offshore accounts, internal trade memos, falsified compliance reports, all carefully constructed to impress investors while masking insider trading, so blatant it was almost childish. The irony was poetic. The man who thought I couldn't operate a toaster had left a digital trail a teenager could follow. I uploaded every discovery into Phantom Rose Holdings, my invisible fortress in the cloud, layer after layer of encryption, each file labeled by date, transaction, and name. Margaret's flash drive gave me the map. Ashton's arrogance handed me the treasure. By the second week, the tension began to hum beneath the surface of our lives. Ashton's calls grew shorter, his voice sharper. The housekeeper whispered that he'd started drinking earlier in the day. Richard had stopped visiting unannounced. Even the staff felt it. That slow unraveling of power. One night, as I passed his study, I overheard him on the phone. "I don't care what the auditors say," he snapped. "Handle it. Pay them off if you have to. We can't afford another compliance delay before the Singapore launch." He slammed the phone down. The sound echoed through the marble hallways, sharp and final. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. His shoulders sagged, his reflection warped in the glass of the city skyline. For the first time, he looked small. When he left for Singapore later that week, he kissed me on the forehead, a gesture of ownership, not affection, and said, "Try not to break anything while I'm gone." I smiled sweetly. No promises. The moment the elevator doors closed, I turned into someone else entirely. Maria, the housekeeper, looked startled when I told her to take the week off. "Spring cleaning," I explained. "I'll handle it myself." What I didn't tell her was that I wasn't cleaning dust. I was excavating evidence. I started with his desk, then his safe, then his personal laptop. Every folder opened like a confession booth, emails with Nathan detailing how to manipulate share prices through strategic leaks, spreadsheets showing trades executed minutes before press releases, correspondence with Richard about removing emotional distractions from their operations, meaning wives. The most damning file sat in a folder labeled Exit Strategy. Not for business, for me. It outlined everything, a timeline for divorce, a psychiatric evaluation suggesting instability, recommendations for witnesses to testify about my emotional volatility, and at the end, a projected profit loss, estimated financial impact of Mila's removal, minimal. Minimal. That word burned deeper than any insult he'd ever spoken. I photographed everything. Every signature, every timestamp, every hidden folder. Each image uploaded itself to Phantom Rose's encrypted vault, my invisible army of truth. By the time Ashton's jet landed in Singapore, I had enough evidence to dismantle his empire piece by piece. But that wasn't enough. Not yet. Revenge, like any good investment, required timing. So I waited. The next crack came from outside, from the market itself. Rumors began swirling about Whitmore Capital's insider connections. The Morrison account withdrew $40 million pending review. Nathan blamed Ashton. Ashton blamed compliance. Richard blamed everyone. I watched the chaos unfold from the safety of the Ritz, my morning coffee growing cold as I read the financial news. Every headline was a requiem in progress. Whitmore Capital under scrutiny after client's exit. SEC investigates possible fraud in mid-tier hedge funds. The empire was shaking, and I was the earthquake. That night, Ashton called. I could hear the panic disguised as anger. "Did you talk to Morrison?" he demanded. "About what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Don't play dumb, Mila. Someone's been leaking information. The timing's too convenient." "Maybe it's karma," I said softly. He didn't catch the sarcasm. Or maybe he did, and it scared him. "Don't get clever," he warned. "You're not built for this world." That's where he was wrong. I had been built for it. By him, by Richard, by every man who'd underestimated me. I hung up before he could finish his sentence. By dawn, new headlines appeared. Nathan Chin under investigation. Key Whitmore accounts frozen pending review. Margaret texted me a single line. "The foundations are crumbling." I looked out over the city, the skyline that had once belonged to him, and for the first time, I saw it differently. Not as something I'd lost, but as something I was taking back. The cracks were widening, the empire was bleeding, and I was just getting started. By the time Ashton returned from Singapore, the cracks had widened into fractures. He didn't notice them right away. Arrogance makes a poor architect. He came home late, smelling of jet fuel and bourbon, his cufflinks mismatched, his smile too tight. He poured himself a drink before saying hello. That was how I knew. Something had gone wrong overseas. "Rough trip?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He gave a dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Rough markets." He didn't elaborate. He never did, but I didn't need him to. Margaret's messages had already told me what he wouldn't. The Singapore fund was collapsing, and the investors were whispering words that made men like Ashton panic. Audit, inquiry, freeze. I watched him from across the kitchen island, pretending to scroll through my phone, pretending to be the kind of wife who didn't understand finance. Meanwhile, my mind was calculating. How long before he realized it wasn't bad luck, but precision? My precision. The following week was a study in disintegration. At first, it was the little things. The way his calls went unanswered, the sudden cancellations of meetings, the forced laughter when he told his father everything was under control. By Thursday, that laughter had vanished. He'd started pacing his office at all hours, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, shouting into phones that didn't ring often enough. I'd leave coffee outside his door just like I used to, except this time every gesture was deliberate, part of the performance, the concerned wife, the calm center in his unraveling storm. Inside, I felt nothing but focus. Diana called me on Friday morning. Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the brittle confidence she wore at dinners. "Nathan knows," she said. "Knows what?" "About Ashton, about the messages, about me." I didn't speak. The silence stretched between us. "He hired a private investigator," she continued, "cloned our phones. I think Richard told him to." Her breath caught on the other end of the line. "Whatever you're doing, Mila, be careful. These men don't lose gracefully." She hung up before I could answer. For a long time, I just sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear. Maybe she was warning me. Maybe she was warning them. In this world, loyalty changed sides like the stock market. Unpredictable, volatile, ruthless. Either way, the information was useful. If Nathan was panicking, the others couldn't be far behind. That evening, Ashton did something strange. He came home with flowers, lilies, my least favorite. I'd mentioned it once years ago in passing. He'd brought roses for every anniversary since, until now. That's when I knew he was playing a role too. "Thought we could have dinner," he said casually, setting the bouquet on the counter, the same granite surface where I'd left my keys weeks before. Just us. He poured wine, the good Bordeaux usually reserved for clients, and cooked, or rather assembled, a meal. Imported cheese, expensive olives, a steak that was still too rare. "You've been quiet lately," he said, watching me over the rim of his glass. "Different." "I've been thinking," I replied. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "About what?" "About freedom." That earned a laugh, one that sounded too loud, too sharp. "Freedom? Mila, you live in a penthouse. You don't even have to think about bills. You already have freedom." "No," I said softly. "I have luxury. It's not the same thing." He poured more wine, leaning back. "You're upset. All this nonsense with the investors has gotten to you. You need a break." He slid a folder across the table. New insurance forms, better coverage, for both of us. His tone was easy, practiced, but his hands, they were trembling. Under the table, my phone camera recorded every page as I flipped through them. Patricia's app silently uploaded each image to Phantom Rose's encrypted cloud. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked, voice silky. "Completely," I lied. My signature curled across the paper, graceful and precise, the same hand that would one day dismantle him. Over the next few days, Ashton transformed his panic into charm. The man who once ignored anniversaries suddenly remembered my favorite songs. He cooked, he complimented, he even invited my mother to visit, something he'd never done before. It was a performance worthy of Wall Street theater. He picked her up from the airport himself, carried her bags, asked about her garden as though he cared. "Oh, honey," my mother whispered later as he poured her a perfectly balanced gin and tonic. "You didn't tell me things had gotten better. He seems so devoted." I smiled, hollow and practiced. "He's full of surprises." That week was unbearable. He was perfect, and perfect in his world meant dangerous. He took us to Broadway shows, booked impossible-to-get dinners, sent flowers every morning, as though he could script our reconciliation. But underneath the charm, the cracks were widening. Every phone call ended in a slammed door. Every market report came with another loss. Every smile looked more like a mask. One night, long after my mother had gone to bed, I found Ashton in his office, staring at the city lights. His reflection in the glass looked haunted. The golden boy dulled to gray. "We could still fix this," he said quietly, not turning around. "What exactly do you want to fix?" I asked. "Us, the company, everything." For a fleeting second, I almost believed he meant it. Almost. But then he said, "You know how much your stability means for investor confidence." There it was. Not love, not regret, leverage. He turned toward me, eyes bloodshot, voice barely steady. "Stay beside me until this blows over and I'll make sure you're protected. You'll have everything you want." "I already do," I said. He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't need protection from the storm, Ashton. I am the storm." I left him standing there, glass in hand, his empire collapsing behind his eyes. By morning, he was gone, off to another emergency meeting. But the real emergency was already in motion. His accounts under review, his partners under investigation, his secrets no longer secret. The cracks had become fault lines, and soon the earthquake would begin. The name looked almost innocent when I saw it printed on paper for the first time. Phantom Rose Holdings, LLC, elegant, harmless, a whisper rather than a threat. But names have power, and this one was designed to haunt him. When Patricia Kim handed me the incorporation documents in her modest Connecticut office, I realized I was holding the foundation of my rebirth. A shell company, legally untouchable, registered under layers of anonymity. To anyone looking, it was nothing. A consulting firm that didn't even have an office sign. But behind that nothingness, I had built everything Ashton never imagined I could. Patricia watched me as I signed the final page. "You understand," she said carefully, "that once this exists, it can't be undone. You'll be outside his reach, but also outside his protection." I looked her in the eye. That's exactly where I want to be. She nodded once, quietly impressed. Then Phantom Rose is yours. And just like that, I became invisible. The next few weeks blurred into motion. Every move had to be calculated, deliberate, almost surgical. Through Phantom Rose, I began quietly rerouting assets, small at first, then larger, each one disguised as a legitimate transaction. A consulting fee here, a vendor payment there, all documented, all traceable on paper, but meaningless to anyone who didn't understand the story behind the numbers. Patricia's voice guided me through every step. Never take more than he'd notice. Move in percentages, not amounts. Think like an accountant, not a thief. And I did. Within a month, Phantom Rose held accounts in 3 banks across 2 states, each layered beneath anonymous trusts. To the outside world, it was a harmless LLC with modest activity. To me, it was an arsenal, one that would outlive Ashton, Richard, and their empire. Meanwhile, Margaret was doing her part. Her messages arrived like clockwork, coded, concise, and devastatingly effective. Richard met with Senator Bloom. Check transfers March 8th. Nathan moving assets offshore through Cascade Group. Internal audit delayed, Ashton nervous. Each message came with supporting documents, with scanned memos, financial statements, voice recordings from board meetings where they discussed optics and containment. Margaret had been collecting these for decades, but now, for the first time, they had purpose. We were no longer archivists of injustice. We were architects of its collapse. One night, we met in person at a quiet corner table in a Chelsea cafe. The place smelled of burnt espresso and rain. Margaret wore her usual gray coat, blending perfectly into the dim light. Her eyes, however, burned with something fierce. "They're panicking," she said, sliding a sealed envelope toward me. "Richard's been making calls to judges he golfs with. They know something's coming, but not from where." I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of wire transfers, large sums funneled through fake charities and shell accounts. "They're trying to bury the evidence before the regulators find it," she said. "They don't realize the regulators already have it." I smiled. "Courtesy of you?" "Courtesy of us," she corrected softly. Her gaze held mine. "You're doing what none of us could. You're not just escaping. You're rewriting the story." I swallowed the emotion rising in my throat. "I'm just doing what's necessary." "No," she said. "You're doing what's right." That night, back at the Ritz, I opened my laptop and began compiling the final dossier, the one that would make sure no one could silence us. I divided it into 3 sections. Phase 1, internal fraud and insider trading. Phase 2, financial manipulation through shell entities. Phase 3, psychological and domestic coercion patterns, the weaponization of power against women. Because this wasn't just about money anymore, it was about truth, the kind that destroyed legacies. The files glowed on my screen, line after line of transactions, dates, signatures, each one a nail in the coffin of the Whitmore name. I encrypted copies to 3 separate drives, labeling them with names that meant nothing to anyone else. Elena, Caroline, Jennifer, the women who had come before me, the women they erased. By dawn, I sent a message to Patricia. "It's time, trigger the legal filings." She replied within minutes. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back." "I don't want to go back." The first domino fell that same week. A quiet inquiry from the SEC into Whitmore Capital's trading history. Then a subpoena request. Then whispers in financial circles that made investors nervous. Within days, the fund lost $60 million in withdrawals. By the end of the month, $200 million more. The empire was bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, and all I had to do was watch. I stood in the penthouse one last time, looking out over Manhattan. Ashton was on another call, his voice sharp with panic. "It's a witch hunt. Someone's feeding them data." Someone was, and she was standing right behind him, invisible in plain sight. He turned toward me briefly, eyes bloodshot. smile forced. "Mila, if anyone calls, you tell them everything's fine. Understand? We're solid." I met his gaze. "Of course," I said sweetly. "We're as solid as ever." Later that night, I watched him sleep in his study, the same chair where he'd once planned my destruction. His breathing was uneven, the empty whiskey glass trembling on the edge of his desk. I thought about all the women before me, the ones who hadn't made it out, Elena's accident, Caroline's exhaustion, Jennifer's disappearance. And I realized something profound. I wasn't just avenging myself, I was avenging them. Phantom Rose wasn't a company, it was a revolution disguised as paperwork. I whispered it aloud, the name that had once sounded delicate. Phantom Rose, a ghost of the woman he thought he owned, and a rose with thorns he'd never see coming. Outside, the city lights blinked like stars trapped in glass. Somewhere far below, the empire was collapsing in silence, and I was rising. It began quietly, as all great disasters do, not with sirens or explosions, but with a single notification on my phone. Morrison Capital withdraws $80 million in ours assets from Whitmore Fund. I stared at the screen from my suite at the Ritz, steam curling from my untouched coffee. The message glowed like a flare in the dark. Small, bright, irreversible. By noon, it wasn't just Morrison. 3 other funds followed. $200 million gone in hours. A slow-motion financial hemorrhage. Ashton's empire was bleeding out and the world was watching. I imagined him in his glass office, hands trembling around a tumbler of Macallan, trying to charm investors through clenched teeth. "Just a market correction," he'd say, voice smooth, smile mechanical. "Temporary turbulence." But markets have a way of recognizing fear, and Ashton's voice, once the gospel of Wall Street, now sounded like panic wrapped in cologne. At 3:07 p.m., my phone buzzed. Margaret's text appeared, short and precise as always. SEC filing went public. Richard furious. Nathan hiding. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of years shift. The kind of gravity that comes when justice begins to turn its gaze. Turning on the TV, I watched the financial networks feast. Breaking news. Whitmore Capital faces federal inquiry. The anchor's tone was polite panic. That sweet spot between scandal and speculation. Every phrase was deliberate. Investigations underway, regulatory review, internal misconduct alleged. No one said criminal yet. That word would come later. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. It was finally happening. Ashton called that evening 16 times. I didn't answer until the 17th. "What did you do?" His voice was jagged, desperate. "What are you talking about?" I said softly, feigning confusion. "Don't play dumb. Someone's feeding them information. The trades, the offshore accounts, none of this was public." "I'm sure the regulators have their sources," I said. "You know how thorough they can be." Silence stretched on the line, long enough for me to hear his breath hitch, long enough for him to realize what I wasn't saying. "You wouldn't," he whispered. "You couldn't." But the thing about men like Ashton was that they only believed in power when it was theirs. They couldn't imagine losing it, not to the wife they'd once called a pretty investment. "You think you can destroy me?" he hissed finally. "Without me, you have nothing." I smiled into the phone, though he couldn't see it. "You're mistaken, Ashton. Without you, I have everything." Then I hung up. By morning, the markets were chaos. Trading on Whitmore Capital's shares had been halted. Rumors spread faster than truth. Whispers of whistleblowers, FBI cooperation, insider. Trading. Richard's empire, built over 4 decades, was unraveling like silk in a storm. Margaret texted again. Richard flew to D.C. emergency meeting. Calls to senators unanswered. Then a second message 2 hours later. Federal agents seen at Whitmore offices. I sat in the suite, surrounded by silence so heavy it felt sacred. The city moved outside my window, alive and indifferent, as one of its kings began to fall. But collapse isn't clean. It's not cinematic. It's ugly. Desperate phone calls, shredded documents, false bravado. That evening, I returned briefly to the penthouse. The elevator opened to chaos. Papers scattered like confetti, empty bottles, 2 phones ringing unanswered. Ashton was in his study, sleeves rolled up, eyes bloodshot, face hollow. The man who once moved millions with a smile now looked like a gambler out of credit. "You're still here," he said, voice slurred from exhaustion. "Good, we can fix this, together." "Fix?" I echoed. "You mean hide?" He didn't answer, just poured another drink. His hand shook. "You don't understand what's at stake, Mila. My father is the reason this is happening," I interrupted. "You both built this empire on lies. You think anyone will believe you? You were part of it. You benefited. The cars, the trips, the penthouse." I stepped closer, my voice quiet but lethal. "You gave me the house. I built the weapon." He froze, glass halfway to his lips, eyes flickering with realization. "You did this." I didn't deny it. "You told me once I wouldn't survive a week without you," I said. "Looks like I'm doing fine." Then I turned and left, the sound of glass shattering behind me as the door closed. At 11:42 p.m., my phone rang again. Unknown number. For a heartbeat, I almost ignored it. But something in me, instinct maybe, made me answer. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" a woman's voice said, crisp and official. "Speaking. This is Agent Sarah Coleman, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to speak with you about Whitmore Capital and your husband's activities." The moment hung in the air, heavy and electric. "I've been expecting your call," I said. Her pause told me she wasn't used to cooperation. "You have evidence?" I looked toward the laptop on my desk, the encrypted folder labeled Phantom Rose still open, glowing faintly in the dark. "You'll find everything you need," I said, "and more than you expect." The agent's tone softened slightly. "Then let's make an appointment. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at our Manhattan office." "I'll be there," I said. "But Agent Coleman—" "Yes? Bring an extra pen. You'll have a lot to sign." When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Not for me this time, but for them. The empire was burning, and the first spark had been mine. Tomorrow, the FBI would have its proof, and the world would finally know what the Whitmores really were. The night smelled of rain and reckoning. It was meant to be a simple dinner. Or at least that's what Ashton's message had said. "Family gathering tonight. 8 p.m., father insists. Wear something nice." As if my choice of dress could mask the rot beneath their empire. I stared at the text for a long time, the words gleaming coldly on my screen. He didn't know I'd already spoken to the FBI that morning, that I'd spent 2 hours in a glass-walled conference room, sliding evidence across the table like chess pieces. Each move deliberate, each document a checkmate waiting to happen. Agent Sarah Coleman had been calm, methodical, almost gentle as I explained how I'd copied Ashton's files, how Margaret had supplied decades of records, how the Whitmore men had turned fraud into inheritance. When I handed her the final flash drive, she'd looked up from her notes and said, "You've built quite a case, Mrs. Hawthorne." "Not a case," I'd replied, "an ending." Now, as my car wound through the rain-slicked streets toward Richard's Westchester estate, I felt something strange, not fear. I'd long since passed that. What I felt was control, the kind that comes from knowing the outcome before the game begins. The estate loomed ahead, its columns gleaming under floodlights. From the outside, it still looked immaculate, but I knew better. I'd seen the books, the forged ledgers, the desperation masked by fine bourbon and family portraits. When the butler opened the door, I could hear the low hum of conversation from the dining room, laughter that sounded brittle, rehearsed. Richard's voice carried above the rest. "Ah, the prodigal daughter returns." His tone was jovial, but his eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed unease. He'd heard the rumors. He knew the investigation was real. Ashton stood near the bar, tie loosened, glass in hand. His smile was perfect, his eyes hollow. He looked at me the way a man looks at a loaded gun pointed politely across the table. "You came," he said. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. The table was set for 12, just like the last time. Crystal glasses, gold-rimmed plates, every fork aligned with military precision. The guests were mostly the same, partners, lawyers, spouses. But tonight, the energy was different. The air crackled with unease. Margaret moved quietly in the background, refilling wine, invisible as ever, except to me. When our eyes met, she gave the smallest nod. "It's time." Dinner began. Polite chatter, shallow laughter, the illusion of civility holding by threads. Then Richard raised his glass. "To family," he said, voice booming. "To loyalty. To weathering storms together." A toast to the Titanic, I thought. Everyone clinked glasses, but no one drank right away. Even Ashton's hand trembled, slightly. "You've been busy, Mila," Richard said, leaning back. His smile was the kind men use when they're testing for weakness. The writs, the lawyers, the stories floating around. You must know gossip can be dangerous. I met his gaze evenly. "Only if it's not true." The room went still. Forks hovered mid-air. "Careful," Ashton warned softly. "You're treading on thin ice." "I'd say the ice cracked weeks ago," I said. "You just didn't hear it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Nathan, already drunk, gave a strained laugh. "What is this? Some kind of confession dinner?" "Not mine," I said. And that's when the sound came. Faint at first, almost like thunder rolling in the distance. But it wasn't thunder. It was the low growl of engines on gravel. Headlights swept across the dining room windows. Richard's expression flickered. "Who the hell—" The front doors opened before he could finish. Voices echoed from the foyer. The unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "Federal agents, no one leaves the premises." The room erupted in chaos. Chairs scraped, glasses toppled. Richard rose from his seat, his face turning a shade I'd only ever seen in paintings of war. "You!" he shouted at me. "What did you do?" I stood slowly, the room spinning in controlled panic around me. I told the truth. Ashton grabbed my arm, his mask cracking for the first time. "Mila, listen to me. We can fix this. We'll fight it. I'll protect you." I pulled free, my voice steady as glass. "You can't protect me from something I built." The first FBI agent entered then, Agent Coleman, rain glistening on her jacket. She flashed her badge, her voice sharp and clear. "Richard Whitmore, Ashton Whitmore, Nathan Chin, you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice." The words fell like a verdict centuries overdue. Richard tried to protest, his voice trembling with outrage. "This is ridiculous. We're businessmen, not criminals." Coleman didn't flinch. "Tell it to the judge." Ashton just stared at me, his world collapsing behind his eyes. The golden boy of Wall Street, undone by the woman he thought couldn't operate a toaster. "You planned this," he whispered, disbelief laced with awe. "Down to the last decimal," I said. Margaret stepped forward then, standing beside me for the first time in 4 decades of servitude. Her voice shook, but her words did not. "You taught me to file everything, Mr. Whitmore." "I did." Richard turned toward her, face twisting in betrayal. "You?" She met his gaze without fear. "You never noticed the secretary who heard everything. That's your real mistake." As the agents led them away, flashbulbs from waiting reporters illuminated the scene through the rain-streaked windows. Margaret exhaled, the sound half sob, half relief. "It's over." I looked at her, this woman who had carried 4 decades of secrets like a crucifix, and said softly, "No, it's finally beginning." She smiled then, a small, weary smile that looked like freedom. Outside, sirens wailed and lights flashed red and blue across the estate's marble facade. Inside, the crystal chandelier trembled, scattering shards of light across empty plates and spilled wine, like the remnants of a kingdom turned to dust. And in the reflection of the glass, I saw myself, calm, alive, unbroken. The woman he said wouldn't survive without him had just watched him fall. Power doesn't vanish when an empire falls. It changes shape. Sometimes it becomes headlines, sometimes handcuffs, and sometimes silence. In the weeks after the arrests, the world turned Whitmore into breaking news. Every network ran the footage on repeat. The FBI agents leading Richard and Ashton through the rain, their wrists bound in expensive watches and steel. Financial titans fall. Whitmore family faces federal charges. The story became legend overnight, a morality play for a nation addicted to wealth and scandal. But behind the spectacle, I was somewhere quieter, in a Brooklyn apartment that smelled like fresh paint and coffee instead of scotch and secrets. It wasn't the Ritz or the penthouse or anything with marble countertops. The walls were uneven, the floors creaked, and the view faced an alley that never quite slept. But it was mine, every inch of it, bought with my own money, clean money. And for the first time in years, I slept without fear. The FBI case grew fast, fueled by the mountain of evidence Margaret and I had built. The flash drives, the recordings, the forged contracts. Every whisper of corruption they'd buried beneath decades of champagne and arrogance was now a document in a file stamped U.S. V's Whitmore et al. Agent Sarah Coleman kept me updated. "Your materials were key," she told me over coffee one morning at the courthouse cafe. "We couldn't have nailed the timeline without them." "How long?" I asked. "For Richard?" She smiled grimly. "He'll die in prison. Ashton, maybe 20 years if he pleads." 20 years, a lifetime measured in regret. I thought it would feel like triumph. Instead, it felt like quiet justice, the kind that doesn't cheer, only exhales. I attended one hearing. Just one. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with whispers and perfume. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens scratching like insects. Ashton sat beside his lawyer, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to our wedding, but now it hung loose on his frame, as if success had been holding him upright all these years. He didn't look at me until the prosecutor played the recording. His recording. The one where he'd laughed about how easily he could control me. "She wouldn't understand a financial statement if I drew her pictures," his voice said, echoing through the courtroom. There was a collective murmur. Even the judge glanced up, unimpressed. When the prosecutor finished, Patricia, my lawyer, my ally, stood. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "my client understood more than he ever imagined." Ashton turned toward me then. His eyes, those same blue eyes that had once promised forever, held no love, no hate, only disbelief. He'd finally realized the truth. He had built his kingdom on the assumption that I would never learn how to rule. And now, he was watching me govern its ruins. After the sentencing, the world moved on, as it always does. The news cycle found new villains, new tragedies. But for me, the aftermath wasn't about headlines. It was about rebuilding. Margaret and I opened the Phoenix Foundation 6 months later, a small nonprofit dedicated to helping women escape financial and emotional abuse. It operated out of the same office where Ashton's fund once stood. The landlord gave us a discount, probably for the PR value, but we didn't care. The name felt fitting, Rebirth Through Fire. Our first client was a woman named Jennifer Chin, the wife of a pharmaceutical executive caught falsifying clinical data. She came in trembling, clutching documents, and a single question: "Do you believe me?" Margaret reached across the desk, her voice steady. Every word. Watching that woman exhale, the way fear left her body like smoke, reminded me why we'd done it all. Revenge was satisfying, but justice? justice healed. My mother visited for Thanksgiving that year. She brought too much food, as always, and filled the apartment with the smell of cinnamon and warmth. "You look younger," she said, watching me carve the turkey. "Lighter." "I think that's what freedom feels like," I said. We laughed, and for a moment I was just a woman in a kitchen, not a headline, not a survivor, just me. Later, when she'd gone to bed, I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker across the skyline. Somewhere out there, Richard was aging behind bars, Ashton was learning what silence sounded like, and Margaret, my co-conspirator, my friend, was probably organizing another stack of files. Power had always belonged to men like them, until now. A month later, I got a letter. Handwritten, the ink smudged but familiar. From Ashton. "Mila, you won. Congratulations. I hope it was worth it. They say freedom feels like air, but here, it feels like nothing. Maybe that's what you wanted, to leave me with nothing. If so, you succeeded. I used to think power meant control. You taught me that real power is knowing when to let go. I never learned that lesson. You did. Don't waste it." Ashton. I folded the letter once, then again, and placed it in a drawer. Not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. Power always comes with a price. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. That night, as snow began to fall outside my window, I wrote a single line in my journal. He taught me how to fight for him. I taught myself how to fight without him. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the faintest trace of peace, the kind that comes not from victory but from reclamation. The empire was gone. The accounts were frozen. The Whitmore name was dust. But me? I was alive, and that was the most expensive thing they'd ever lost. There's a quiet that follows justice. Not peace exactly, but stillness. The kind that hums beneath the surface like the pause before a new song begins. 6 months after the trial, I woke before dawn to the sound of Brooklyn coming alive. Sirens in the distance, someone's radio spilling jazz into the cold air, the low rumble of a subway beneath the street. The city wasn't polished or perfect, but it pulsed with life. And that morning, so did I. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up in someone else's house, under someone else's name. I wasn't performing the role of Mrs. Whitmore. I was simply Mila Hawthorne, the woman I'd been before luxury, before control, before the gilded cage. But this Mila was different, sharper, steadier, unapologetically her own. I made coffee in my small kitchen. No marble counters, no designer appliances, just a chipped mug and a view of the city I'd built my freedom in. Outside, snow drifted gently onto the fire escape. Inside, my phone buzzed. "Margaret, we're on for 9 a.m. New client, big one." I smiled. The Phoenix Foundation had grown faster than either of us expected. What started as a single desk and 2 women with a stack of evidence had become a movement. We'd helped 17 women so far, some rich, some not, all trapped in the same elegant prisons I'd escaped. Each case was a mirror, each story a variation of my own. At 9 sharp, I walked into our office, the same space that once bore Ashton's name in polished brass. The irony still made me grin sometimes. Now the frosted glass door read, "The Phoenix Foundation Legal and Financial Advocacy for Women." Margaret was already there, wearing her usual pearls and an expression of determined calm. She looked lighter too, decades of silence replaced by purpose. "Morning," I greeted her, setting down my bag. "Morning," she said, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "Our client's waiting. She reminds me of you, the first time you walked in." I hesitated. "Scared?" "No," Margaret said softly. "Ready?" The client was a senator's wife, polished, graceful, and terrified. She carried a leather folder thick with documents and shame. "My husband's campaign is under investigation," she whispered. "He's shifting money. I found things I shouldn't have." Her hands trembled as she passed the folder to me. Inside were bank transfers, falsified donation records, the kind of breadcrumbs that could topple another empire. I looked up, meeting her eyes. You did the right thing coming here. But if I go to the authorities, Margaret interrupted gently, you'll be safe. We know the process. The woman blinked back tears. How do you know? I smiled faintly. Because I've lived it. She didn't need to ask more. When she left, Margaret turned to me with that quiet satisfaction only she could pull off. You realize, she said, you've become what Ashton feared most. I raised an eyebrow. Independent? She chuckled. Influential. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that felt new every time. But later that night, as I walked home through the winter air, her words echoed in my mind. Influential. It wasn't power I'd wanted, not really. It was freedom. And yet, somewhere along the way, freedom had become its own kind of power. A week later, I stood on a stage for the first time, not as someone's wife, not as a victim, but as a founder. The Phoenix Foundation was receiving recognition from a women's finance initiative. The ballroom was full of people who'd once whispered about me, now clapping for me. The irony wasn't lost. The host introduced me, a woman who transformed betrayal into blueprint, pain into purpose. Mila Hawthorne. The applause was deafening. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. My voice, when it came, was steady. They told me I couldn't live without him, I began. They said I was too dependent, too fragile, too decorative. What they didn't realize was that every woman learns differently. Some learn to serve, others to survive. I learned to rebuild. The room fell utterly silent. The Phoenix Foundation isn't about revenge. It's about recognition, of strength, of resilience, of the truth that you are never too broken to start again. We've helped 17 women so far. Next year, it'll be 70. After that, 700. Because once one woman learns to rise, she teaches the next. When I stepped off the stage, Margaret was waiting with tears in her eyes. You did it, she whispered. I squeezed her hand. No, I said. We did. That night, back in my apartment, I lit a single candle on my windowsill. Outside, the city glowed gold beneath falling snow. Somewhere out there, the Whitmore Empire existed only as court transcripts and archived news footage. I opened my old journal, the one I'd started at the Ritz. On the final page, I wrote, he built an empire of deceit. I built one of truth, and mine still stands. I closed the book and looked around, at the walls I'd painted myself, at the stack of client files on my desk, at the keychain that held only one key now, to my office, not a man's house. I wasn't Mrs. Whitmore anymore. I was Mila Hawthorne, founder, investor, survivor, empire. And the best part? I hadn't just survived him, I'd outgrown him. Freedom doesn't roar, it whispers. It's not fireworks or applause, not the rush of victory that fills a courtroom or the thrill of headlines spelling your name. It's subtler than that. The sound of your own footsteps in a space that belongs entirely to you. The rhythm of your breathing when you no longer have to measure it against someone else's expectations. It's waking up and realizing there's no one to perform for. Spring came early to Brooklyn that year. The air was softer, the light warmer. From my apartment window, I could see the city unfolding in color. Shopkeepers washing winter dust off their awnings, children chasing pigeons, an old man selling tulips on the corner. I stood there, barefoot, coffee in hand, watching the world go on. Not my husband's world of steel and glass and numbers, but this one, messy, real, alive. 6 months had passed since the sentencing. Richard Whitmore would never leave prison. Ashton was serving 15 years in minimum security. A privilege wealth couldn't buy, but influence could. Margaret and I visited the courthouse one final time for the last round of formalities. She wore a new navy suit that fit her like dignity reborn. I'd never seen her so sure of herself. When the judge adjourned, Margaret turned to me and said quietly, "You know what the best part is, Mila? We didn't just win. We ended them." But I shook my head. "No, Margaret. We began us." The Phoenix Foundation was thriving. Word spread faster than we'd imagined. Women who'd been silenced for years, by fear, by contracts, by power, started coming forward. Not just wives of the wealthy, but assistants, analysts, accountants, all carrying stories that began with "I thought I was the only one." We turned those stories into strategy, fear into funding, pain into purpose. Each morning, I walked through our glass doors and saw the same sunlight pour across desks once used to launder millions. Now they held laptops, coffee cups, hope. On the wall behind reception hung a plaque. "Freedom is the quiet power they never taught you to wield." Margaret had it made for our first anniversary. She said it was my quote. I told her it was our truth. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought about Ashton. Not with longing, those days were long gone, but with curiosity. Who was he now? A broken king in a paper crown, a man who finally understood the weight of the lives he'd crushed? He'd written twice from prison. I never replied, not out of bitterness, but because the woman who'd once needed his validation no longer existed. Once, I'd measured my worth in the reflection of his approval. Now, I measured it in the voices of the women who walked through our doors and left standing taller. One afternoon, I found myself at the Ritz-Carlton again, walking through its familiar marble lobby. The concierge, a new one, smiled politely. "Checking in, Ms. Hawthorne?" "Not this time," I said, smiling back. The last time I'd been there, I'd been running from a life that looked perfect and felt like prison. Now I was simply passing through, unchained, untethered. I ordered tea in the cafe and sat by the window overlooking the city. The same skyline, the same glass towers, but they looked smaller now. Less like monuments, more like mirages. The power I'd once envied, feared, fought for. It wasn't real. Real power wasn't in skyscrapers. It was in knowing you could walk away from one and never look back. That evening, Margaret came by my apartment carrying 2 takeout boxes and a bottle of champagne. "No speeches," she said, setting them down. "Just dinner and bubbles." We sat on the floor, laughing like old friends. Not a billionaire's wife and his secretary anymore. Just 2 women who'd built something from ashes. At one point, she raised her glass. "To the Phoenix," she said. "To freedom," I replied. Our glasses clinked softly, the sound echoing through my small living room like the quietest victory song. Later, after Margaret left, I opened my window and let the city's hum wash over me. Car horns, laughter, life. Somewhere below, someone was playing an old jazz record, the melody climbing toward my window like a promise. I thought about the women who came before me, Elena, Caroline, Jennifer, ghosts whose stories had guided me toward my own awakening. They weren't forgotten anymore. They were foundation stones beneath every case we took, every life we rebuilt. Their silence had been their prison. My voice had become their freedom. Before bed, I wrote one last entry in my journal. The same one that had started at the Ritz, filled with anger and fear, now ending with something gentler. He said I couldn't live without him. He was wrong. I didn't just live. I learned to rise, not loudly, not perfectly, but completely. I closed the book, placed it on my desk beside the Phoenix Foundation's first annual report, and turned off the light. Outside, the city glowed, endless and alive. Inside, for the first time, I felt the stillness of true power, the kind that doesn't demand attention, doesn't seek revenge, doesn't tremble. It just exists, quiet, steady, free. And that's the truth no one ever tells you. Freedom doesn't have to shout to be powerful. Sometimes it's a woman sitting alone in her own home, smiling to herself, because she finally knows she doesn't owe her happiness to anyone else. That's not revenge. That's rebirth. That's the quiet power of freedom. She didn't just survive him, she outgrew him. He built an empire of greed, and she built one of grace. He traded truth for power, and she learned that real power is truth. From the marble penthouse to a Brooklyn apartment full of sunlight and laughter, Mila proved that freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It's in the soft click of a door closing behind you, the weight of keys you no longer need, the sound of your own heartbeat steady and strong. To every woman who's ever been told she's too dependent, too emotional, too small, remember this: they only say that until you remind them what you're capable of. If this story made you feel something, pride, peace, anger, or hope, hit that like button, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment when Mila took back her power? Was it when she left the keys on the counter, or when she built an empire in her own name? And don't forget, subscribe for more Undercover CEO life-changing stories and tales that prove even when the world writes you off, you can always write your own ending. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living free.